Let's get back to today's session. And to lead the session, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Joe Robinson.
Thank you, JP. It's great to be here. So I'm Joe Robinson. I'm the founder and CEO of Hummingbird. We are a platform for managing compliance operations. Anti-money laundering is at the core of our product, and we are focused on the investigation and regulatory reporting process. I have a number of great guests that I'd like to introduce to you all today, and we'll just step through and have each of them give a bit of their background. It would be great, Charlotte, if you could kick us off.
Okay, sweet. Hello, everybody. My name is Charlotte Lowry, and I'm the Deputy MLRO from Pleo. Pleo is a Danish fintech. We're actually based out in Copenhagen, which is a wonderful city, and everybody should visit. So yeah, I lead the anti-financial crime movement there. We're about kind of 5-6 years old. And we are an issuing business where we issue business spending corporate cards that pretty much do your expense reporting for you. So long gone are the days of sitting with a pile of receipts around you, or a nice little app will solve it all for you. That's me.
Thank you, Charlotte. Nice to have you. Mikey, do you want to give some of your background next?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So yeah, I'm Mikey. I'm a consultant with FINTRAIL, which is an anti-financial crime consultancy based throughout the EU and APAC. Prior to joining FINTRAIL this summer, I was working at Monzo for almost 3 years at Digital Challenger Bank as one of the first few financial crime operations members, and worked through their investigations team and into their compliance roles as well.
Thank you, Mikey. And last but certainly not least, and definitely with the best background, we have Sam Sheen from Stripe on today.
Oh, thank you, Joe. And hopefully I'm providing a bit of festive spirit with my background. So hi, I'm Sam Sheen. I'm currently the Financial Crimes Compliance Officer for EMEA for Stripe, as well as the MLRO for its Irish entity. And Stripe is a global fintech. We are an e-payments business, but essentially we enable businesses to do business online in an agile and fluid manner. My background is really interesting. It includes working several years offshore. So my risk appetite is really high, as you can imagine, but also at the same time, I used to be an AML FC regulator and was in charge of enforcement and dealing with some naughty firms who should have known better. So that's a little bit about me.
That's great. Thank you. So our topic today is optimizing for investigations in a distributed world. As many of our companies, and certainly I'm sure for many of the attendees, because of the global pandemic, we've moved to a work from home or largely work from home environment. And that has proven to be an interesting challenge for a lot of financial institutions, specifically around some of the investigation procedures that they have and how they're fostering collaboration and working across the team. Why don't we dive in with that topic? Panelists, if you could share a bit about how the move to work from home has affected your companies and when you made that transition, and if you have insights about when you might be transitioning back, that would be a great place to start things off. Sam, do you want to share some of what's happened on Stripe on that front?
Sure. I can tell you a bit from what I know and where we're headed, having joined in September. So the transition to home wasn't that difficult. Obviously, being a pretty savvy tech company, we were really able to quickly send out laptops, make sure everyone was able to work remotely. And I suppose we were blessed in a lot of ways. We've got sort of the security set up to be able to do that. I think, though, as we've heard the wonderful news about the vaccines coming out, the potential that we all could be going back to work, I think what's probably more of an interesting outcome for us is how we're going to deal with the folks having worked for 12 months at home. A lot of people have worked extraordinarily long hours, run a lot on adrenaline. They may have seemed as though they're incredibly productive, but in some ways that's been to fill the anxiety of the unknown, not being able to see their families, not being able to move around. So I think we really need to be careful as we roll back in, whether Stripe has some people at work or no people at work for a long time to come. We've really got to be mindful of taking care of our people's mental health and emotional well-being, because I think we need to be cautious. We don't assume this is how everybody always works. Potentially we'll run the risk of burning out people. So we're very alive to that at the moment. And, you know, we're really reaching out, making sure people are okay, especially this time of the year. It's pretty tough.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point. I feel like the work from home environment for a lot of people is actually increasing the stress and the monotony of the work itself. You know, Mikey, have you seen any of that in the advisory services that you provide or the work that you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the kind of benefits as well, though, some of it is that a lot of fintechs especially are already distributed, and a lot of those teams, like Sam said, is out there. And whilst it's important to you know, take those considerations that Sam said, I think another key one is that when you begin to come back into the office from everyone almost essentially working on that equal playing field, everyone is distributed, everyone's in the same mindset, is that when you begin to bring those central functions or people back into offices, is to remember that you still have people that are remote, and to like be aware of that. Like, you don't tip the culture balance, or you don't tip any work balance or life balances like in disproportionately against one of those, against your distributed teams or your teams that exist predominantly in an office, which is quite a hard challenge to do if you're in, you know, a company like previously the Monzo, you know, the FinCrime team was about 160 people. It was majority distributed. It's a lot of moving cogs that you have to be aware of. But if you have a strong culture and you focus on it, then it can be done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Charlotte, how has the transition to the work from home environment gone for Pleo?
I think that was super interesting. So the interesting thing about Denmark is we weren't working from home as much as you guys were in the UK. But I actually got stranded in Scotland for 4 months when I tried to come home for 2 days. So I had the nice experience of watching my colleagues in Denmark be in the office while I was stuck working from home. So that was like a very interesting flip side. We also had a lot of people join our team who were super fresh to financial crime, had never really done anything in the space before, and had to pretty much do all of their training remotely, which was pretty interesting. Pleo in general, we really foster like a work from home environment and a remote work-life culture. We have a lot of engineers in Canada, so everybody really leaned on them and said, how do you do this as part of your everyday life when we're kind of just flung into it? I think like the ideal thing about working in a fintech is working from home wasn't super difficult for us. Like, as soon as we have our laptop, we're fine. And luckily I had my laptop when I came home for 2 days. So yeah, it was about just kind of making sure you check in with your team, you check in with the new people, try and form kind of new training regimes and checkup regimes, and also just make sure people shut their laptops off, because when you're working from home, it's so easy just to watch the clock tick away and it'll get like 9 o'clock and you don't need to catch your train home or your bike home or anything. So yeah, that kind of burnout rate ramps up a lot higher when you're working from home.
It's almost useful to create a separate space if you can, even if it's in a common room or something like that, to do the work and then transition to you know, normal home life after that. Just out of curiosity, I mean, for anti-money laundering and anti-fraud investigations, you know, when my own team is looking at some of those things and on teams that I've been in the past, for trickier situations, we find that it's often helpful to have multiple people reviewing the same information or almost collaborating on looking at the behaviors. Have any of your teams, you know, used any practices or, you know, sort of procedures to foster that in this new distributed environment, whether it's, you know, Zoom meetings like this one or, you know, collaboration tools for the investigation work?
I think like we use a lot of the basics like Zoom and Google Docs. We were all in there at the same time, or kind of everybody's best friend, and kind of just being aware that you can shove somebody a link and say like, hey, I'm sitting in this room, come join, let's go through all this. Just as easy as you can kind of walk over to somebody's desk. We tried to really make it like you're still working with each other all the time. But yeah, there was no need to really overcomplicate it for us. We just used the same tools as we were already using. I think as fintechs, we're pretty lucky in the fact that we're all pretty tech savvy and we use these things a lot anyway. And we just kind of upped our use of them in a day-to-day?
So I have a slightly different take on this, and it's probably because I'm just so old and I've been through this before, which is I think the collaboration bit has been really good. I think though the risk that people need to be really alive to is that idea of self-confirmatory bias, right? So making sure that you have a culture that allows for robust challenge, because I have seen instances where people get together and they're talking about something and basically the culture doesn't allow someone to go, oh, I think you've got that wrong, or well, I don't see that, or how did you get there? And instead they sort of go with it, oh, that's great and that's super and that's really good. Well, you don't really learn from that. And the other thing I think is really interesting is as fintechs start to scale, they need to be mindful of when you eventually have things like an internal audit function, everything you write down is now fair game. So if you write down as part of an investigation a bunch of silly things, and I say silly things having learned from experience, which is, well, they could be right, they could be wrong, maybe they're a criminal, maybe they're not a criminal, and you think you're just bantering away, you need to remember there's a trail you've created. Slack is one thing, but I always say to people, if you're going to exchange discussion around it, think about what it is you're trying to probe onto. Are you trying to figure out if it's a predicate offense? You're trying to figure out what tactics somebody's using. And then the moment you realize you're in the land of you're talking about a suspicion, you really need some strong protocols to make sure all of a sudden that communication network comes down really tight. Otherwise, it's really hard to explain to a regulator who doesn't work in your day-to-day environment why you're not worried about tipping off. In their mind, it just seems like it's just mushrooming out of control and everybody knows something. So I think that's really important as you scale as a fintech to recognize the bigger you get, the more diverse your population, the harder it is to keep that collaboration information nice and tight.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It's and I think on a somewhat related note, this format, this Zoom format or Hangouts or whatever the tool is, can almost, another spin on that is can almost bring voices into the conversation that would normally be more introverted in a group setting, or and I think Sam, we spoke about that as well. Like you can almost use it for the reverse effect, which is to have great and tight communications, but also seek out opinions and voices that would normally not be as participatory.
Yeah, I do tend to find the listeners, the ones who don't seem to speak up, tend to be the ones who've picked up everything that's going on and spot the little details. And, if sometimes they just don't want to fight over the sandwich to get 5 seconds of space to talk. And you could be, you always have to remember if someone is dominating the discussion, all that means is they win on the discussion, but it doesn't make it right. So really bringing those people in and properly curating the discussion, if you are the deputy or the MLRO, is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that moderation of the discussion and the it's a good skill set. Still trying to figure that out myself. No, that's great. How about decision-making authority in this setting? It's something where every investigation needs to be dispositioned. A lot of times there can be very important decisions about someone's financial account or behavior that are made through the process of investigation. How have you thought about your decision-making process and the way that you actually move the team through that in this setting? Is it more formal? Is it, what are you using to facilitate that process? I can call on someone unless someone has thoughts.
I'll kick off. I think kind of being in an organization, our decision processes are different. We're usually helping clients with their decision-making processes. And I think the key right now with everything being distributed is keep it simple. This now is not the time to, I think when everyone goes remote, and if you're not used to working remote, especially with bigger institutions, is that there's a panic to make sure that there's a set of controls and principles in place to keep everything safe. And sometimes that can become overkill. So really kind of drilling into do we have a really clear decision process for each of these different work streams, whether that's getting sign off on, onboarding a PEP, or that's like, submitting a SAR to whatever enforcement agency is in there. Like, what is that line of communication? Who is ultimately responsible for approving that? And is there any steps that we can take out to make this easier? Because making that easier as well is going to reduce the stress of your teams. It's going to increase the productivity as well. And with everything being online, with communicating with Slack, Teams, Gmail, stuff gets lost. And Sam, you made that good point about like everything has to be auditable when you start talking about these things. And if it's not simple and it's across, 7 different Slack channels and 18 different people are asking to have input on it, it's a nightmare for like keeping that audit trail succinct and to the point with what we're trying to achieve with decision making.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think as well, though, I've seen two really unfortunate models when it comes to decision making. So one I've seen where there's somehow this committee, which on the face of it looks like it's supposed to help the MLRO make a decision, particularly for big ticket clients, right? If you're potentially talking about offboarding a big ticket client for, unusual or suspicious activity, that's a really big decision to make. That's great if it's helping the MLRO, but not if it's really designed to basically suffocate the MLRO from making the tough decision that they need to file a SAR, right? And in some instances I've seen it's cloaked with good intentions, but that's exactly how it ends up operating. But the other one I've seen is where we sort of end up like a campfire collective where you just keep going round and round and round in circles where we're trying to get everybody comfortable with the idea we're going to do something. And the truth is, we're not deciding where we're going on vacation. We have a potential suspicion of criminal activity. We need to make a decision, particularly if it was something like around trafficking, for example. It shouldn't take weeks. I mean, the FinCEN leaks, although not directly relevant to all of us, but sent across a pretty good message, which is taking too long to make these decisions is a bad look, even when it's found out by the general public. So you have to, there's like social imperatives, reputational imperatives. But that having been said, there is an argument to say it's a big burden on an MLRO to make the decisions whether to disclose or not. And they need to give their investigation team a really clear idea when it's okay to do something, when they want to know if it's a big account that's going to be affected. Because if you lose the confidence of the business because you're very low risk appetite and you immediately offboard something, you haven't really thought through how you're going to manage the situation once the filing's taken place, you will not get back that confidence from the rest of the business, and they will look upon you with great skepticism.
Yeah, I think another
Absolutely.
part of that is it made us definitely realize that these things need to be kind of formalized when you're in the office. And Pleo is quite a small team. Everybody speaks to each other. Everybody knows what we're doing. But as soon as you're separated by seas and distance, then having formal processes written down where everybody knows which version you're using. And it's not so much like, oh, there's a version here, it's a version here. Oh, this doesn't fit quite right. Oh, do we need to make updates? At the start of the lockdown, we totally rewrote every single one of our policies, and we made sure that procedures have owners. And it really kind of made us like step up our game and say, hey, are these actually fit for purpose? Which sounds like a very, very basic thing, but when you're sitting in an office and you can lean over to somebody and be like, what do I do here? Then you kind of take it a bit for granted that these things are kind of the basic essentials that need to be sussed out before you can really kind of move any further.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think as an MLRO, right, part of your job is to help people learn. So if you just keep telling your investigation team whether they should file something or not, they're not going to learn anything, right? As opposed to, as the MLRO, you're saying, why are you worried about that? Or sometimes the fundamental question is, are you sure that's financial crime? I can see there's why you're worried, but is that actually a financial crime you're looking at? Or is it, say, purely a reputational risk, in which case, are we the right team who should be handling it, for example? And that at least gives people the opportunity to learn for themselves. It's a bit like teaching. You can teach someone to fish, or you can just give them a fish. Teaching them to be able to go through those questions and challenging is going to make them far more useful as your investigation team than just deciding for them. Because then you end up with a lot of delegating upwards and you'll just be a drowned MLRO.
I think that's a really important point as well, is that with the learning and development point, is that especially I think now with everything being distributed and people have gone through that kind of panic stage probably for the first 2 months, is all of the decisions were coming to people like the MLRO, and that's overwhelming for them as well. And you've probably got a team of pretty talented people around you if you've hired them. You know what type of person you're looking for, and don't be afraid to delegate to them, share those responsibilities. If you have like a good quality control or assurance program in place, then you should be confident that they will be able to take decisions and you're not putting anything else additionally at risk within there. And also that decreases your stress, it increases your productivity to do things elsewhere, focus on bigger things for the year ahead.
It's also like a huge empowerment piece. Like, we've hired you, we believe in you, we've trained you, go and do it. Stop relying so heavily on some people. I think maybe people are a bit kind of unsure of themselves and they just need a bit of a push and say, hey, like, the assurance net, I'll catch this if this isn't right. But the empowerment and the trust is all on you.
Absolutely. And let's tie some of the, so we just spoke about the work in a distributed environment. Just to recap, work in a distributed environment, supporting the decisions and the MLRO, and the importance of policies and procedures. If we sort of tie those topics together and get tactical for a moment, you know, how do you actually provide that toolkit of investigation procedures, resources, things like that? I know people are now working in, you know, Zoom and in Slack. We have a great question that we'll come to in a moment about the use of Slack in investigations. I would love to hear what each of you have seen in terms of standardizing the toolkit for these decision-making process and things like that. How do you actually communicate that to your team, particularly if the team is growing or using external resources, consultants, staff augmentation, things like that? How do you ensure consistent, you know, financial crime investigations across those environments? Google Docs. Anyone want to jump in? Good or bad resources that you've seen with just, you know, how are these policies and procedures, or maybe a need to do so if that's where we are today?
I think you go ahead.
I mean, I think like fintechs are all kind of born out of annoyance and stress and strain, and people kind of initially think of this as kind of for the product or for the customer base, but for sure that's true of kind of our side of this financial crime side. We've all been in larger organizations where we're doing things for the sake of doing it, or you're hunting to find things to tick off for the sake of doing it. So what we've done is we've kind of really written out our kind of larger base compliance strategy of what we need, what we kind of definitely need, and what we don't need. And we put down a kind of toolbox of exactly where we can get this information. One of like where all policies and our procedures are. They dictate kind of the tools that we recommend to use and the tools that we don't recommend to use, like what's fitting and what's not. And we also kind of take our investigators through these and really make sure people understand it, but also give them the opportunity to say, hey, I don't understand why we're doing this, or if this is worth our time, or here's a new tool. But it's definitely about having kind of one source of truth, be that in whatever tool you choose to use, but making sure everybody knows where to find things and what brings value and what definitely doesn't bring value.
I think that to support that as well, like having the kind of that central sort of toolkit to say this is what you should be using, and you know if it's not in here you shouldn't be using, to keep everyone aligned, is around. It's great to have like these things written down and, you know, sheets saying the red flag indicators and this is how you handle it, but when it comes to actually interpreting it in with what's in front of you, that's always going to be different every time. So supporting that with identifying people in your investigation teams who are have domain knowledge of specific typologies like terrorist financing or tax evasion, who really know the ins and outs of that, and calling those people out and making them available to be able to be around for questions from slightly more junior members of the team or people who have maybe never encountered a specific type of topology, and like really using your human resources around you as well as just having these digital ones that they can use to get through the kind of the process steps. But really that also creates a learning opportunity at the same time, and for both parties, the teaching part and the learning part, and probably makes you more efficient at identifying the types of financial crime that are going through your platform.
Yeah, I think understanding that when you hire folks, right? If you think about the theory around how people understand things, right? You think of the theory around the Johari window, right? So people know what they know, but you'd be surprised how many people don't know what they don't know. And so people will often be hired on, and they presume you're expecting them to be overly confident, and they're supposed to know every topology and every red flag, and also how it manifests itself. So I think in some ways you have to be really, really conscious of that, because people will sculpt down what they see to their level of understanding. They could be missing all sorts of stuff, or falsely presuming something's problematic when it's just a different way that your product is used. So in some ways, I think it's beneficial to actually teach people, how do you actually ask the right questions? How do you go through a process where you're asking the right questions, where you get to the point where you know either to stop and ask yourself the question, am I trying to prove something bad is happening here? In which case you're going in the wrong direction. Or have I come to a dead end where I cannot find anything that suggests to me this is anything other than suspicious? That's a different question, but we often don't. We often just presume people intuitively know how to do this. So I think that toolkit needs to include guiding people. How do you go through the analysis necessary to then go, and here's where you stop, and here's where you make a determination?
I think that knowing where to stop is such a key piece, because we always find that when you people start, they say, "Hey, I've been doing this for hours and hours. How long should it take me? Is this too much?" And you say, "But where did you reach suspicion? And wherever you've reached suspicion, then that's it, because you're just going to waste time, you're going to waste energy, you're going to get burned out too quickly, and we could be far more efficient." So in my perspective, that's quite an intuitive thing. It takes time, it's quite hard to teach, but it's easier to show people and to give them examples when they're actually doing it. So looking back on something and saying, trust your instinct. Like when you say, "I've reached my suspicion here," then I trust you and believe you, and we'll pick it up if not.
I would add to this that, obviously at Hummingbird, we're a platform in this space, but we're believers in introducing tooling and technology that can facilitate the investigation process. And, what we see is the industry puts an enormous emphasis on upfront training, which makes it very expensive to onboard new people and can be a bit nerve-wracking, I think, for both the MLRO as well as the people who are being onboarded, right? Because you're uncertain about the quality of the decisions and the investigations being conducted. And, we see, great financial institutions that are innovative and kind of pushing the envelope on technology, investing in, platforms and tool sets that can help the investigators move through the process according to those standard procedures, right? And make sure that they're gathering consistent data from everyone. The implementation, of course, ranges from, Microsoft Word documents to, custom in-house solutions and technology vendors like ourselves. But it does feel like there's opportunity to, focus for our attendees for this panel, right? To kind of focus on, like, maybe you take a week and step back and just started, a document that lists out the investigation tools available to your team, and the links and the, the search accounts and KYC tools and things like that that you have access to, in order to foster knowledge sharing across the team. It feels like an important step, and I'm guessing, some of the earlier stage companies in the audience, and probably even some of the more established players, have never kind of thought about building out a toolkit that would be useful in that perspective.
Joe, the one thing though I'd say that has fallen by the wayside, and it's great that we've all got awesome technology and super keen engineers once they get the financial crime prevention bug, right? And then they get it and they're like, oh, this would be cool stuff to build. But I think the one thing that's continuously lacking is it's really hard to write a SAR. It's really, really hard to write a narrative, a proper, clear narrative. And we seem to presume that because people just exist, that they're really good at writing stuff. And you'd just be amazed. And I'm sure Mikey's seen this too from FINTRAIL's perspective, like the wide variation. And despite how many FIUs coming back with feedback about these could be better, they could be more complete, we still kind of let people try and kind of flounder around and write these things. And the truth is there's a real art to doing this properly, but also in an efficient way and also in a searchable way, right? If we don't use the same lexicon each time we write these, it becomes profoundly difficult to find trends and do a bit of analysis and see if you're noticing something, an emerging risk out of there. And sometimes we treat it like, oh, we're all far too busy, there's too much going on to take the time to teach people how to write this. But I really think it's an opportunity that we're missing.
It feels like an underserved area of the tech in this space is, there's facilitation of tickets, if you will, of alerts, things like that, cases. But then the opportunity to actually layer in some guidance on top of, just tracking the status of a case feels like it's missing. And I think we could probably spend a full panel or more on the SAR and its effectiveness as a communication channel between law enforcement and industry. It sometimes amazes me that, kind of unstructured text is the most desirable medium for that communication, given, all of your great technology companies and the rich data that you have. It feels like there's a lot of signal loss. We call it signal loss just in the format itself, right? And so seeking out better ways to communicate that information to our partners in law enforcement feels like an area to spend some time on. What, one of the things that we were sort of interested in on that note is, what are the inefficient processes for your teams today? It may be the narrative, and maybe we should spend some time on that in this panel. Are there other inefficiencies that you all are observing, at companies around you or within your own work? Mikey, it might be interesting to start with the consultative perspective here, if you wouldn't mind me calling on you.
Yeah, of course. It's quite easy, like being consultant, to look from the outside in and see the inefficiencies that are maybe not seen inside. And I think the biggest one for me that I see is especially with either young companies or companies that are perhaps going through some sort of like remediation or trying to change their or scaling like quite rapidly, is that they have too many cooks in the kitchen with these processes. They everyone wants to have a kind of say to make sure that like something's being done right for the product, something's being done right for compliance, for the second line, for assurance. Everyone wants to kind of have that spoon in there, which is great to the participation and the want to be able to participate in these things, because ultimately we're trying to prevent risk here, but that can become overkill, and that's where these processes start to grind to a halt, especially if it's something coming from a junior staff member in investigations or someone onboarding has said, here's a PEP, can we onboard them? And the deputy MLRO says, yeah, cool, but the MLRO says no, and then that then becomes like a whole thing where it becomes, that's the discussion that then drags on this decision, when ultimately one person should have that responsibility to say it. So I think really thinking about who you've got in a room when it comes to these processes, and especially again with the decision making and the sign off, is who does need to be here and who doesn't need to be here, and the people that are in the room, do we trust them enough to make that call where we don't need to check their homework to make sure that they've done it okay. And I think once you can get to that, you begin to have like a really lean decision making model, and you should just be able to kind of trust those people that you've got around you to be able to make those decisions independently of you having, or another team having to have a say in there. And that probably comes from communication as well, as constantly talking to your other teams too, to say that, if you've got a FinCrime investigations team and a FinCrime compliance team, is being aware of each other's goals, being aware of each other's like bigger goals in the company and the strategy and what those two teams are trying to achieve, and your decision-making processes should align to them and not look to kind of conflict with anything that they are trying to achieve as well. And that's, I guess, how you come to kind of a bit more synchronicity in your processes.
So more on this interesting, it's kind of the second topic under which the decision-making process is emerging as a really important variable. How structured can you get on a decision-making process? I mean, do you folks have kind of a framework listed out? Is it visible? Is it, do your teams sort of know for certain situations who has the autonomy for the decision?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we have it listed out in kind of different scenarios. So if it's whether it's something on the product side, it depends what kind of flows it touched, and depends what flows it touches. Then it needs to go through kind of either a compliance approval or just a compliance comment. So it really depends kind of how big impact this is. So yeah, we have them listed out, and this is also a recent thing that we realized that we needed to do over lockdown. We were kind of found ourselves a few times kind of chasing people and saying, hey, we need to put this decision process in here. So we kind of spent the past few while really documenting this out. So most things, they're pretty clear who needs to say. Yes or no? But that's pretty easy for us because we're pretty small. We don't have kind of numerous decision makers to follow through. So we're kind of starting at the bottom and trying to start right.
Yeah, and I think it's hopefully it's different for fintechs. I mean, when I was at a larger financial institution, I can remember once when we decided we were going to offboard someone, and at the same time, one of our branches in another jurisdiction offered them a commercial loan. We were like horrified, going, "How the hell did that happen?" Right? So we hopefully are not in that space. But I find it really interesting because there's very much a collaborative effort, right? When there's something problematic that everybody wants to jump in and contribute. But what you will often find is financial crimes gets dragged into a lot of things. So I find the decision making is a lot easier when it's a straight suspicious activity that we've got to look at. I find as the MLRO, what I spend a lot more time on focusing on is stopping my team being dragged down rabbit holes they don't belong in, because what we understand to be suspicious activity has a much more broader meaning outside of our team, and so there'll be all sorts of things where we can easily be dragged into where they'd like to know if we have a view, and I can't really afford to lose a staff member for a day skipping through the daisies on something that's really fascinating when I know my fraud team's all over it and they can do that in about 15 minutes, right? So in some ways I get to be, miss unpopularity sometimes, where I have to go, yeah, that's really nice, close that off, that's not us. We've got a team who deals with that, that's not us, and that's the end of the story. And conversely, the danger is, of course, when you widen stuff, when you do have suspicious activity, is when you have to do the chop and go, from here on in, we can't talk to you. And people are going, it's like you ripped the last chapter off the book. What are you talking about? You can't talk to us. You can't tell us what happened. And in some ways, I think, lesson learned in how we manage our messaging in terms of how we're investigating and at what point to stop. I think it's really hard if you're a newer MLRO. It's really difficult to do this unless you've had some practice and you're able to distinguish between. But I think if you're a bit more longer in the tooth, you've seen where this has happened. But you've got to sort of teach by example, right? You have to be able to say to people, right, look at what we've done. Let's look back on some past investigations. How could we have done it differently? I'm all in favor of writing down process, but you do need some flex. When you get that report at 4:00 on Christmas Eve, I cannot go through the 7 steps of a process when I know that most people have gone off on holiday, right? Sometimes I'm just going to have to make a decision and do it, and not get bit on the bum because I didn't follow steps 4 or 5, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good related question to that, Sam, from the audience here, do you require consensus in areas where there might be crossover between fraud and financial crime, anti-money laundering initiatives? Like, how do you sort of coordinate those two areas of fin crime?
Do you know what's really interesting? We tend to work really well together, but I think it's in part is because we actually know what fraud is. So we're actually able to talk to them to go, this is the point, do you guys think you've actually got money laundering in there? And they're able to go, yeah, this is definitely yours, and vice versa. The way we do it is we do an assurance process. So we have our fraud team who may offboard for a variety of reasons, but then we do an overlay on those accounts where we independently will check whether there's other forms of financial crime involved, in which case we'll then take it from there as part of our SAR reporting. So I think part of that, though, is you're always going to have the challenge of territorialism. Always. You're always going to have this problem with fraud. And it's just the way that we're set up. But you have to, I think, consciously cultivate some relationships over there. I think you should do all the right things. Fraud is really important, particularly if you're an e-payment institution, right? It affects lots of things, your fraud rates. But equally, you need to get their trust to say, we're not trying to barge into your territory, but if there's something else here, if you see more than one repetition of something, this isn't a one-off, you guys need to get it to us as quickly as possible. And once you've shown them you're not trying to, get on their turf, so to speak, it works really well. But it really does require talking, because it's not always obvious in the first instance. It's actual financial crime and not just fraud.
I think this is something that's super different in kind of these fintechs and startups than kind of these traditional banks that most people have come from, where the fraud and financial crime, we speak a lot. Before I joined Pleo, it was kind of one team. Now it is 2 teams, but we still believe like the 2 are very, very intrinsically linked. So we're very close to our fraud team. We speak nearly every day. we work together, we share a transaction monitoring system. So we're obviously going to talk a lot about changes to that we're doing. So I think like the most important thing is to just maintain that kind of open sense of communication and don't go back into those banking days of these being like us versus them, because there's a link that you can't get away from and you've got to love each other.
Gotta share openly. Yeah, I think like it's funny because like you want that open collaboration, and there's a great kind of follow-up question here, which is, so is there sufficient knowledge sharing or, information silos? It feels like coming back to some of what you all are offering is to say, there needs to be collaboration, there needs to be trust, because I love the metaphor that you use, Sam. Sometimes you have to rip the last chapter out of the book, depending on visibility requirements. But it feels like there's got to be a built-up trust and collaboration leading up to that point, and then a shared understanding maybe of why that process is like that sometimes.
Yeah, and it's amazing the stuff that you'll find out from your investigations if you have to put the hard yards in to understand fraud, right? It's not for them to come and find you, but you'd be amazed how much stuff is generated by your fraud team, which is super useful for transaction monitoring, for typologies, for emerging trends, for red flags. And even when you do your business risk assessment, that data is super helpful to show that you have controls in place, even if your team, the AML team, isn't actually doing them. So, I mean, they're an amazing opportunity to really show how your program's bolstered. So, you should have a quarantini with them this Christmas. Get to know them. Go say hi.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like, and I love that last note there. Like it feels like if you're not already sort of scheduling deliberate time to foster that relationship and the collaboration, it's certainly not in this Zoom powered environment going to happen on its own, right? And so creating the touch points with that team is really, really important to do on a regular basis, actually. I want to just pause for a moment. We're in the last 15 minutes or so. Invite the attendees to drop questions in the Q&A. We would be more than happy to have the discussion kind of focus on some of the questions that people have. There's actually one that I think is great from Megan Millard. Hi, Megan. Good to see you here. How do you make sure that important conversations initiated on Slack are memorialized for your audit purposes, right? New company communication channels, sometimes grassroots, being used without the official blessing of the company IT team. How do you ensure that those things are preserved in audit history when appropriate?
I think it's hard to do just because of the nature of Slack, and a lot of firms or fintechs especially have so much noise on them because they're running essentially their entire product from Slack. You can have 2,000 people on that one thing, so things will get lost. But I think a kind of way to start working towards making that practice safer, and especially with FINTRAIL where it does need to be auditable, is have really clear channels where if you're asking for a decision on a specific thing, it has to go in this channel. It's not being approved somewhere else. And that channel can be, if we're talking about suspicion and that needs to be locked down, can be a private one with only people in the room that need to discuss that. But everything should you don't want too many channels, whether it's kind of a catch-22, but you should have that specific place where people know to ask for that. So if you have a regulator come and say to you, show us the paper trail for this, how did it get to you? You can say, cool, that was on the 22nd of July last year. Let's go back into that channel and let's find that conversation. And I think culturally, it has to be, everyone has to, understand that. And when they do see a conversation taking place, saying like, hey, let's move this to the appropriate kind of channel. Let's move that into a place where an understanding it's that auditable bit, not that they're trying to lock people out of those decisions, but making sure that we're following processes, and like all processes, not just that one at hand.
Yeah, we really try and shut it down. We've been through our kind of early days of Slack being the easiest place, but we kind of make it very clear to people now that here's the appropriate kind of email inboxes, that this is where things need to happen, or here's the other source of truth, so this is where it needs to happen. But yeah, Slack is your best friend, but also your worst enemy when it comes to things ending up there. And we're pretty blunt when things come in Slack when they're not supposed to.
It can be so nefarious for, personally identifiable information sharing, PII getting leaked into Slack channels where that shouldn't be, customer names, customer information. Yeah, I think that's a problem probably that every company in finance has, unless they have a really locked down IT policy. We have tried to move, and in fact, Hummingbird provides this sort of collaboration in the chat into the case itself where it's appropriately secured, but not every company has that. And I know it can be quite a challenge with such an open product like Slack. So it feels like maybe training in some way, maybe setting a soft expectation in Slack to say, when you see it, there's a reaction emoji or a comment or something like that that provides some soft training to say, this isn't appropriate here. We need to move it to an endorsed channel for this type of information.
Yeah.
Just think of it practically, right? Just think of it totally
Mhm.
practically. When people leave, there's nothing for everybody else to follow up on, right? Like
Right.
it's gone and nobody can find it and they don't know who was included in the thread. And I'm all for people who need to vent their spleen a little bit, because there are times when you just are having one of those days. If I go on Slack and say, this person's killing me, like this is just really frustrating, that's fine. I have no issue with that. But I think, someone needs to draw a line and go, okay, so now we're flipping over into wherever it is that you put your stuff. But I think, though, to that end, you have to have a place where you memorialize this, right?
Mhm.
Because if you don't, you can't prove that what was your thinking process, whether you decided to disclose or not.
Mhm.
Yeah, we have a very fierce DPO who will jump on your back, and then we'll do the very easy screenshot, send it in an email and say, here it is. But if you're caught doing it a second time, that's it.
Yeah. We had a fun, I was at Square for years, and although I wasn't in the compliance or risk function at the time as a product manager, there was still an emphasis on information security and keeping personally identifiable information safe and secure. And as a payments company with a credit card reader attached to your phone, the punishment for it was someone could come over and fine you $1 that you had to pay on the spot, and it was sort of this fun cultural thing. I don't know if there are equivalent soft ways to have a similar kind of social enforcement, particularly in the strange work from home environment that we're all in now. But if you can create a cultural element that just reminds people in a friendly and ideally fun way, that, oh yeah, you're not supposed to share this here. That can be a good way to set a reminder.
We just go for public shame. It seems to work.
Public shaming. Well, great. A couple more questions here. Thank you, audience. So from Hector Dawkins, how did you maintain camaraderie in your teams when we went into lockdown? Was there any special place for levity, and how do your procedures change, if they changed at all, for addressing issues of mental health? I think those are all, a couple of important topics there. So, just to start, what are your teams doing to foster camaraderie and informal communication in the online environment?
Gosh, I came in late, so I'll let Charlotte go first.
Yeah, it was quite different because everybody was in our office in Copenhagen. There was a small period where everybody else was home, but we shifted our Friday drinks online. We set up a compliance cook Slack channel to share like what we were spending all this spare time cooking. Yeah, we were pretty open. Our company moved a lot of quizzes online. We're fairly young everybody was keen to jump in and share. We started a comedy club every Tuesday night. Every Wednesday, people shared their hobbies. There's pretty much something on every single night. And Pleo is quite an interesting company in the sense that most people move to Copenhagen from anywhere else in the world to start there. So your friends are your colleagues. So you kind of just spent the evening on Zoom with your friends. And yeah, with the mental health stuff, it's definitely something that we need to put more emphasis on. But everybody's fairly open and everybody speaks to each other. And there's a few people who were made it very clear that they were open for people to speak to. But yeah, there was definitely kind of more needed there. But the Friday drinks online helped.
I think it's tough. I think that initially, both when I was advising different companies and then when I subsequently joined Stripe, you had lots of energy initially where there was lots of things to keep people busy, particularly people living on their own, right? Who didn't have other people to hang out with. This was their only source of contact. I think that people start getting a really serious Zoom fatigue, right? Like instead of being a really fun, engaging thing, it feels like a constant proof of life. And, it's exhausting looking attentive 6-7 hours a day, right? And for some people, they just find it exhausting. And, we do have the odd people, and I love you people, but you drive me crazy who say, oh, well, I was in lockdown. I learned 3 foreign languages and I knit myself sweaters for all my neighbors' dogs. And I learned how to, on and on you go. And there's other people going, I haven't gotten out of my bathrobe in 3 days. Right. And so we need to figure out what's that balance, because as we celebrate these people who've really taken, inspiration out of the lockdown period, there's a lot of people who found it tremendously hard to cope. We have a supplementary sort of allowance at Stripe that allows people to go and do whatever it is that makes them feel good. So it's a set monthly allowance. So whether that's, say you want to talk to a counselor, say you just want to go and, I don't know, you want to do an online game. If you are able to get out of lockdown and you want to go join a swimming club, something that is just you for your time. And so everyone's got that. Plus there's an allowance to allow people to set up remote in their offices at home, because for a lot of people, they had little rugrats who were running around and needed attention, and they don't have a desk, right? And so they're working off a kitchen table. So an allowance was given to all the staff so they could try and set themselves up and just feel a little bit more grounded. So I think in some ways, what we really need to recognize, we have some tremendously talented people, and some are totally, they're Teflon, man. They can get through anything. Like there's the people who should go to Mars in the next spacecraft because they'll be perfectly fine. For the rest of them, including myself, sometimes you just need some downtime. And I think we just need to know how to flex that to go, if they're not on the screen, it's fine. But if you do see early signs, think about buddying people up, and not your boss isn't always the right person to buddy up if people are okay, but you might want to informally buddy up with a peer, to someone who can check in and make sure you're okay. Or if you have been turning off your Slack a lot, turning all your notifications off for some time, just checking in, texting them on the phone as a peer to say, hey, are you okay? Is everything all right? I think that sort of stuff's really, really important for people's mental well-being, because it doesn't feel like they're being performance managed. It feels a lot more caring in some respects.
Yeah, and I think if things like that if you've been used to being in an office for since like you started working like wherever you were, and there's things that you got benefit from. So what I used to sit next to my manager who I worked really close with, we were also friends. So the first 50 minutes of that day was hugely beneficial to me, to setting that up, to getting engaged in the headspace to do that. And then obviously when we lock down, it's not the same because we're in 2 different places and it's online, but trying to find an equivalent of something that works for you to kind of help that. So we said like, okay, every 2 days or something, we'll just have half an hour blocked out in our calendars, or we will just catch up. And we don't need to talk about work. We don't need to do this. We'll just try and maintain that sort of 15 minutes that we did every day in the morning, and just find a way that, like, because it's hugely impactful, and just find a way to try and find a sort of a digital equivalent that gets you through until are back into that usual environment.
I think also a really important thing is making sure people get off Slack and stop working. So we set up like a Strava competition to say like who can kind of get out and run like how many times a day. And as much as some people like really flipping hated it, it got people away from screens and away from the computer, and that little green Slack emoji was turned off, and that's probably super healthy.
Mm-hmm. I think we have encouraged people to actually take phone call like one-on-ones rather than Zoom, and encourage sort of a walking one-on-one if you can go outside and walk around and take it, because I'm with you all about this Zoom fatigue, you know. By hour 10 of the day of like sitting in my chair here on Zoom, yeah, it's brutal. Another great, you know, on the mental health question, it's so important. I mean, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, right? And to some extent, it feels like people are trying to operate, you know, it's like business as usual, which I think is maybe a mistake. There's a wealth of coaching resources, and sometimes having, you know, a retained coach that people can reach out to and set up a 30 to 60-minute session with is all that's needed. It's not a, you know, it's not a full on, it can be for any kind of purpose and topic area. It just allows people to talk a little bit. That's something that, you know, we've seen be effective as well. Well, this is great. I think we are in our final minute here, so I want to just take a moment and thank you all, the panelists, for your answers. Thank the audience for the questions, and of course, FFEcon for putting on this amazing event this week and adapting to the new format and the new environment that we're all in. Thank you for having us on.
Thank you very much, Joe. I had to restrain myself because I really wanted to join in that conversation there at the end, because it's definitely something that I thought a lot about. And at FINTRAIL, we've done quite a lot to ensure that our teams are kind of operating well, and we're concerned about their mental health. But unfortunately, I'm not on the panel, so therefore I must shut up and just get on with proceedings and ceremony. So big thank you to Mikey, Charlotte, and Sam for sharing all your practical experiences there, and like a big thank you for all the preparation you put in for preparing this session. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope to see you at the next session, or possibly tomorrow. If not, I wish everyone a very Merry Christmas.